Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about, well, I guess about authoritarianism. I've been reading a book, and it's written by two American Democrat Party lapdog hacks, and they were flunkies during Obama's presidency, and they're two-bit little flim-flams, but they're being richly rewarded as people who helped the globalist project are. So they've written a book about authoritarianism, and it was given a great sort of promotion, and the publishing company got right behind it and really gave it a good push, and other leading globalist political figures have recommended it. It's been talked about on CNN and MSNBC as being a tour de force and all this sort of stuff. Anyway, I've had a look at it. It's absolute rubbish, and it's just nothing but bald-faced lies and just journalistic tricks of association. For example, I'll give a super, an over-the-top example here to illustrate the point. Genghis Khan murdered tens of millions of people. Donald Trump was known to like Genghis Khan. So there you go. So they associate something terrible and negative in history, but then put the person they want to denigrate next to it. Sons and Sons did this, not unlike the methods used by Donald Trump, and so they try and do associations like that. But let's have a look at authoritarianism. What is it? Does the book even define it? Well, it doesn't. While saying that it's omnipresent and it's everywhere, and it's around every corner and under every bed, and it's in every closet. They say it's everywhere, but they don't define what it is. It's just somehow in the ether, or just tied up in the miasma of things. But they don't define it. So it could in fact be anything. Now, on top of that, they don't give examples of authoritarianism. And given they haven't defined it, then examples are hard. So again, it's done by association. So now they'll do, again, the journalistic tricks that things are really, really bad, that less than a fifth of the world's population is living in conditions you consider to be somewhat or reasonably free. And you go, wow, only a fifth? Holy fuck. I mean, Hitler is average, only a fifth. Gee, what a fucking problem. Nazis are obviously everywhere. Oh, hey, whoa, Nelly. Now, throughout human history, the reality is that a very small proportion of the population you'd consider free, or relatively free compared to others. Now, I suppose we can define freedom by equal application of the rule of law. Due legal process applies equally to everybody, and people get the vote, and they can vote for different candidates depending on their preference and the policies that those candidates may have. So you can say those are benchmarks of freedom, and other things like freedom of association, freedom of worship, or things like that, freedom to own property, and so on, and where the government can't arbitrarily seize your property. Now, if you use sort of various benchmarks like that, then really, up until, say, the early 1800s, there weren't really many freedoms around. Like even the French Revolution purporting to have many freedoms and bestow many rights. In reality, the revolutionaries applied arbitrary law, arbitrary arrest, arbitrary execution. So this idea of the rule of law and the vote and so on didn't really come into being until quite a bit later. The same in say the early United States. Getting to polling booths was hard work. You often had to travel a long way. So really, as a relatively small proportion of the population were voting. So there were freedoms that maybe weren't in other areas, but if at the end of, say, the Revolutionary War, if you were known to have been sympathetic to the other side or the the British cause or helped the British in any way, then your property could be arbitrarily confiscated and so on. So it's difficult to find a point when significant rights not only existed but were available to the majority and were protected by law and by the government. So this idea that only 20% of the world's population are free or relatively free, it has ever been thus. In fact, 20% is probably the high point. So this idea that things have gone backwards, sort of everybody was free yesterday, but because of authoritarians, only 20% have it today. Holy fuck! No. 20% is pretty good. In the overall scheme of things, and nearly all those freedoms are in the advanced economies and the Western world, although being ruthlessly taken away by the globalists. So it's ironic, these people are who are writing this book are confirmed rabid globalist propagandists, but they would have us believe that the globalists are not authoritarian. They don't rig elections. They don't have people cancelled off social media. They don't control the mainstream media. No, the globalists aren't authoritarian. The German politician said, well, I don't care what the people think. We'll continue with our policies towards Russia, and that's it. I don't care what the population wants. When you hear things like that, you have authoritarianism. Authoritarianism means that the leaders must respond to the wishes of the people, or freedom, rather, means that they must respond to the wishes of the people. And the globalist controlled governments clearly do not. Now, they go on to say, well, we're surrounded by all these authoritarians, so who are they? We've never been in so much danger from authoritarianism, they insist. Again, they haven't defined it or really explained what it is or which countries are losing these freedoms. And they sort of imply that freedoms are being lost all over the place. And it's a very dangerous situation, and boy, do we have to do something about it. But they don't say which countries have lost their freedom. They imply some have. They imply that Russia, for example, Russian people have lost their freedoms because of Vladimir Putin. Now, I'd like anyone to point to say any time in history when Russians have been free. There was the Tsarist regime where there was an advisory parliament. They had no real powers. An advisory parliament, the Duma, but the Tsar had dictatorial powers and could dissolve the Duma at whim. So it's hard to see or hard to find really that there was universal franchise or even universal male franchise or those sorts of things. They weren't there. The law was pretty arbitrary, and you had bush lawyers like Vladimir Lenin going around the rural areas representing farmers and the rural folks in court or in the rural district courts. But I can't find a time in history anywhere where the Russian people have been free. I mean, the freedoms that they did have were very brief and very, very modest. For example, between 1905 and 1914, there was a very minimal form of representative democracy. But again, the Tsar still maintained veto powers over anything. So you could say there was a very brief and very small window of very minimal freedoms there. But following that, the Russian people haven't been free. Even if you look at the end of when communism fell over, 1990, all that sort of thing, the government that briefly came in, like Boris Yeltsin and that sort of thing, they were corrupt and useless and up to all sorts of gangsterish type stuff. Journalists still disappeared and opposition political people were found floating in the river, that sort of stuff. So the idea that it was free and just and that sort of thing was nonsense. So this idea they put Putin up as an authoritarian, and that the Russians had freedoms and then he's taken them away. The Russians never had those freedoms or any freedoms, or nothing that was lasted longer than 5 minutes, if at all. So this idea that Putin came along and took away the freedoms that the Russians had is nonsense, utter, absolute nonsense. So now they can argue that given he has continued on as either prime minister or president and that sort of thing, and this means that freedoms have been lost. I suppose you'd put up an argument that maybe some freedoms that Russians would like have been prevented. You could possibly put that argument up, but the idea they had freedoms that Putin took away is utter crap. Simply not true. Now, so Putin is one that they mention, and the other one is Viktor Orban. He's apparently an authoritarian. On what basis do they say that? He's won a democratic election, that sort of thing. But if you don't vote the way that the globalists want you to, then you're an authoritarian. Now, given that they single out Putin and Orban, then you've got to assume that they're approving of all the other elections that go on, all the other leaders that get up. So it seems that when politicians that the globalists approve of and that have been handpicked by the globalists to take office and engineered and shoehorned into office, like the Jacinta Ardern's and the what's that part-time drama teacher guy in Canada, Trudeau, and so when people they want get in, then the election is legit. If people they don't like get in, then the election is not legit, and that's just how they do it, and that's their identification of authoritarianism, or how they would define it in that context, at least. So Viktor Orban has apparently taken away the freedoms of the Hungarians. Now, when they're talking about hundreds of millions have lost their freedom, which hundreds of millions? The population of Hungary is what, like 10 million. So what's that's hardly the hundreds of millions category, but nonetheless, now have Hungarians lost any freedoms? Well, I again, what freedoms did Hungarians have that they've now lost as a result of Viktor Orban? They don't explain that. They just assert he's an authoritarian because well, we don't know, he just is, just take our word for it. But they cite no examples of it, or they'll use examples like he wouldn't allow gay, lesbian activists to run around the universities unchecked. Authoritarian. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure I'd agree with that. But anyway, they try that sort of crap on. But the Hungarians have never been free. They're freer today than I think they ever have been in history. So now, if we just look at say, Hungary was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you could say that the elites had freedoms there, and they did. At the end of the First World War, Hungary was separated or became a separate nation, and a guy called Admiral Horthy, Horthy, was in control, and he. There were some freedoms, I guess. You wouldn't call it a runaway sort of democracy or anything, but that only lasted from, I think, what was it, 1920 to 1938, I think, somewhere around there. So that was very brief, whatever freedoms that had. Then there was the Second World War, where effectively martial law was declared. Then the communists came, and they stayed until 1990. So and there were certainly no freedoms during that time. So now, following that, Hungary had to sort of reinvent itself, and has gradually put its economy together and tried to work things out, coming out of so many years of communism. And turning to free market policies. And Viktor Orban is a democratically elected prime minister. He doesn't believe that mass immigration is a good thing. So that's the globalists hate him for that. That alone's enough to make him an authoritarian in their propaganda eyes. He doesn't believe in creating social division along lines of race, sexuality, and gender. That again, that's the globalists' sort of 101 playbook. That's how you divide society: race, gender, and sexual proclivity. Orban won't allow that, or his government won't allow it. And I don't know why on earth would that be a bad thing? Why would that be an example of authoritarianism? Globalist insurgents tear your society to pieces, but that's considered democratic or something. I don't know. But when it comes to China, they kind of go all kid gloves and say, well, Xi Jinping's kind of maybe authoritarian in some ways, but really he's just a fucking good guy. He's a fucking good guy, and the economy's doing well. And because money's being put in people's pockets, that's really equivalent to freedom. So he's not really an authoritarian. So the very minimal methods they used to define Viktor Orban as a dictator, they then use those same things and say that Xi Jinping's not a dictator. So anyway, the book's absolute nonsense, heavily promoted, allegedly a bestseller. And of course, the last authoritarian they assert, don't explain or define or anything like that, was Donald Trump. So he's a democratically elected president, and they say he's authoritarian, but they don't say why or how. They just say things like he didn't like mass immigration, or he wanted to build a wall, or he put children in cages. They use those sorts of things that only half state what the situation is. People smugglers were bringing children in that they were sort of renting, if you like, underage children, just so it would give them an easy in to the United States. So if these people couldn't prove the children were theirs, and many of them were not, then the children were sort of held in a separate area while they confirmed the the bona fides of the claim that somebody was their mother or father or brother or something. So now Obama actually started that, so it's nothing to do with Trump. That Trump was trying to reduce illegal immigration. I mean, that's authoritarianism, excuse me. So they couldn't come up with any decent or any plausible or accurate thing. They just asserted he was. And then they say authoritarianism's on the rise and we're all in danger as a result of it. So an absolute utter nonsense of book. So whenever you hear about this so-called authoritarianism, just reject it. It's bullshit. The only authoritarians around the place are the globalists and the media and the flunkies they control. I mean, look what Merrick Garland's doing in the United States: arbitrary arrest, arbitrary raids, arbitrary detention, coordinating the White House and Department of Justice coordinating with the big media firms to deplatform people and cancel them and so on. What, that's not authoritarian? I mean, for fuck's sake. You've been Tassos today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.